Welcome to the Politics People. My guest today is a former Conservative Member of Parliament. He's also a former UKIP Member of Parliament in the UK. I'm talking today to Douglas Carswell. Thank you so much for doing this.
Hi there, how are you?
I'm very, very well. Listen, I really appreciate your time on this. The thread throughout these podcasts is people who've had an impact on history, on politics. Are you conscious of the impact that you've had on British politics and probably by extension world politics?
Well, I don't want to over exaggerate things. I mean, we had a referendum in this country on whether we should leave the European Union. I think it was a fantastic result when we voted to leave. I think it will not only make sure that the lives of 60 million people in this country are better and healthier and happier. I think that it's good for the future of humankind that Britain leaves the European Union. But ever since that result, lots and lots of people have tried to take credit for it. The truth is there were 17.5 million people that are responsible for that decision. And I played a small role in trying to make sure we got a referendum and trying to make sure that we won the referendum. But I'm a minor footnote in history, a very happy footnote though, and very happy to leave it to others to try to dominate the history books. I went into politics for one thing, I achieved it, and I left on my own terms, having done it. And I'm delighted. I'm delighted that politics in Britain today is full of people who claim that leaving the European Union was their idea all along. That's wonderful. The more they claim credit for it, the more secure our future outside the EU becomes.
I'm going to have to unpack this. You only went into politics for one thing. What specifically was that one thing then, if I'm not being too dumb?
To get Britain out of the European Union. I grew up with a certain idea of Britain. And I became increasingly concerned in my early 20s to discover that we had given away our democracy. We were increasingly governed by a small, remote elite in Brussels. And we were, I think, badly run as a result. And so I, together with a couple of friends, Daniel Hannan, Mark Reckless, and a couple of others, we set out to try to do something about this, to try and force the referendum, to try to force Britain out of the European Union. In order to do that, I joined the House of Commons. I got elected to the House of Commons. Mark Reckless did too. Dan Hannan didn't. He went into the European Parliament. But we pushed and we pursued a very specific, very deliberate strategy. And I'm very, very pleased that we have now seen the UK leave the European Union. Once Britain had voted to leave, and once I felt that the referendum result was done, I stood down from Parliament. I stood for 4 elections and 1 referendum campaign, and that's what I went into politics for. And once we had achieved that, I felt it was time for me to get on with the rest of my life and do other things.
That's incredible. The reason I wasn't feigning ignorance. I was really ignorant. I didn't know that your sole purpose for entering parliamentary politics was the pursuit of leaving the EU. I again, for no particular reason, I'd imagined that you were if you like, a regular Conservative MP at that time who had perhaps seen the light and had the conversion. But that was actually before you even got into politics. That was that you were using the parliamentary position, your platform, with that as the end goal. I didn't realise that. That's pretty smart.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in my early 20s, I spent quite a lot of time living and working in Europe. I spent quite a lot of time, in particular, living and working in Rome, in Italy. And I became very concerned about how the European Union had, I felt, hijacked Europe's identity, and certainly hijacked the sense of purpose that Europe should have, and hijacked the very proud 2,000-year history that Europe had, and hijacked this for very, very foolish political designs to create this centralized state that is an incredibly destructive and malign and malevolent influence in European and indeed world affairs. And I remember in my early 20s living in Rome thinking that this incredibly malign influence of European integration had to be taken on and had to be fought. And I was very conscious of the fact that I returned to the UK because I wanted to do something about this. I'm not anti-European. I think European culture and civilization is pretty much close to the pinnacle of humankind. I would say perhaps the American branch of that European offshoot is perhaps even slightly higher. Don't get me wrong, European culture and civilization is an incredible achievement. But the small gangster elite who sit in the capitals of Europe today and who claim Europe's heritage in order to justify an anti-democratic, insane kind of economic policy formation to prop up this malign bureaucratic empire, that's not something I felt I could sit back and tolerate. And I don't just believe in British exceptionalism and English exceptionalism. I'm a strong believer in American exceptionalism too. I hope that all the different peoples of Europe will wake up to quite how awful the Brussels regime is and do something about it. And I hope that Britain leaving the European Union demonstrates how peacefully we can reverse this catastrophic and historic mistake for Western civilization.
Do you think that the dragging of the feet, if you like, of the last 4 or 5 years, what is it, 2016, of the last 4 years, so we're in 2020 now, and it's, yes, technically we've left the EU, but there is still this deal being negotiated. And I personally won't feel happy until we are completely resolved as to the deal, but because you still feel like there's trying to get a cat out of a room. Basically, it's like digging its claws into the timber work. But are you? And I wasn't going to ask this. This is just my own personal angle. Has there been a positive by the fact that it's taken so long to enact the vote of 2016? And I'm only asking this because from my limited point of view, it seems that if we'd have left the week after, if we'd have triggered Article 50 the week after the referendum, I've got a feeling we'd be back in the EU by now. But part of the even Remainers or people sitting on the fence or swing voters seeing how the sausages are actually made, all the machinations of trying to keep us in, seeing our own parliament trying to side with the EU, I think has actually been a great contributor to perhaps now overall winning the hearts as well as the minds of the British electorate. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on my rambling.
You're absolutely right. When people voted by a million-strong majority to leave the EU after this very lengthy, detailed referendum campaign and lengthy discussion, there was the most extraordinary attempt by the political elite in this country, aided and abetted by bent judges, aided and abetted by the broadcast media, aided and abetted by former civil servants, to try to overturn the referendum result. And this took on a lot of different forms. One of the ways in which they sought to do this was to negotiate a deal that would be Brexit in name only, so that notionally we would have left the European Union, but we would have been bound by EU rulemaking. It would have been as if in 1780 something, after the Battle of Yorktown, as if George Washington had sat down and signed terms with George III's ambassadors and agreed that America could have its own flag, but it would still have its laws made and imposed on it by a government in London. So there was this attempt, but they overplayed their hand. They asked for far too much. And you're absolutely right. This, I think, woke people up to the extent to which the political elite in Britain were colluding with unelected officials in Brussels to try to overturn the popular vote. And if anything, I think this has reinforced the message in Britain that leaving the European Union is not only absolutely essential, but it has to be accompanied by domestic reform to tackle the morally bankrupt and incompetent political elite here in the UK. And so I think in a weird way, from the point of view of the Remain establishment, the pro-EU establishment, they've been incredibly foolish. They could have compromised, and they could have negotiated and made compromises that would have allowed them to blunt the impact of the referendum. Their own folly and misjudgment and political stupidity, based on a profound misunderstanding of the country that they purport to represent, because of all of that, they've played their hand so badly, they've actually pushed Britain, thanks to Boris Johnson, with a massive majority in Parliament, in a direction that fundamentally realigns the UK away from the EU. I never dreamt that we would go this far in realigning ourselves away from the EU. And in a weird way, the Brussels machine has done the work of people like me for me. It's made it far easier for Boris Johnson to look to have complete separation. And I think this has proved incredibly popular. One of the reasons why this government has a massive majority in the House of Commons and is way ahead in the opinion poll ratings is precisely because it's seen as honouring the referendum result. And people like that. So I think what we're seeing here is a fundamental realignment of British foreign policy away from the EU, hopefully closer ties with the United States and the Anglosphere, India in particular. I'd love to see Britain realign itself much more closely with the English-speaking countries, India, America, Australia, Canada, and many others.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. You touched on it. I was saying I want to unpack this thing. The part you skipped over, because you've been brought up better than I have, and so you're not going to crow about it, but it's your contribution to this. And again, this is predominantly an American podcast, so I'm just going to give a very, very quick sketch of my take on what you did. You were in the UK Parliament. When did you first become an elected MP? Hello?
I got elected. I got elected as a Conservative.
Yeah.
I was elected in 2005 as a Conservative.
2005.
I left the Conservatives and I joined UKIP in 2014. If I was going to explain it to an American audience, imagine a scenario where you were a Republican congressman or a Republican senator, and you felt that the Republican elite, the Ivy League elite that ran the Republican Party, were simply not in touch with your values anymore. Imagine if that the Tea Party, for example, set itself up as a rival to the Republican Party. I did the equivalent of standing down from Congress as a Republican, changing to this new startup Tea Party, UKIP, this insurgent force, and I then insisted upon getting re-elected under the colours of this new party. I could have easily stayed in the House of Commons, just switched parties. Lots of politicians have done that historically. In the last parliament, I think I'm right in saying about 24, 25 of them did that. They switched parties. I felt that was wrong. I felt that was wrong, A, in principle. If you're elected under the colours of a particular party and sent to Congress or the House of Commons to do a job as a Republican or a Democrat, you owe it to the voters, if you're going to change party, to offer yourself back and get re-elected. But there's also a historic reason why I did it. Until 1918 in this country, if a member of parliament was asked to join the government, that was seen as changing sides. They were seen as having been elected as a representative of the people. They were joining the government of the day. They were expected to call as a matter of honour a by-election. It was, think about it as a confirmation hearing. Instead of having a confirmation hearing just on the floor of the Senate, you have a confirmation hearing back in your district. And I felt that actually I needed to go back and ask 80,000 people to decide whether or not they wanted me to remain as their MP. And I felt it really important, because what I was trying to do was try and ensure there was a referendum to get us out of the European Union. And I thought to myself, if I can't even get my own local voters to back me on this journey at step one, I probably shouldn't be pushing for a referendum. So for me, it was a great reality check. It was a great way of me testing the audience that I was trying to appeal to. And I not only got their support, I think I'm right in saying I got the largest swing to any party in any election in British political history. So that convinced me that, A, I had the support of local people for it, but B, we were probably in a position where we could launch a general insurgency at a national level against the establishment, and we did that. And we it was close, but we won that one too.
And what was the reaction backstage from both parties? Did the Conservatives, before you left, have any inkling that you were going to jump ship?
Well, I put a lot of pressure on David Cameron as Prime Minister. I happen to like the guy. I happen to think he was actually quite a good Prime Minister, but I disagreed with him on this issue. And I had honest disagreements with him. And I pushed him as far as I felt I could. And then we got to the stage where, having promised a referendum, I felt he was reneging on that promise. Having promised to try to renegotiate the UK's relationship with Europe, he had watered down that promise and turned it into a promise for general EU reform. And that was the point where I thought, I can't be putting up with this any longer. And initially, I think it was Mahatma Gandhi who said, when you first stand up for something, they laugh at you, and eventually they agree with you, and you win. Initially, there was quite a lot of mocking laughter. I think quite a lot of people in the Conservative Party, particularly the upper echelons of it, thought that what I was doing was eccentric and nutty and slightly mad. But then when UKIP was on 18, 20 points in the polls, and we won the Clacton by-election, and other MPs started to join me, I think they started to stop laughing and started to get a little bit worried about it. It was interesting. By the time Boris Johnson won a majority of 80, leaving the European Union on precisely the terms that Dan Hannan and myself have been advocating for over a decade, was Boris Johnson's flagship policy. I saw plenty of Tory politicians who at one time had sniggered and mocked the idea that we should leave the European Union, earnestly explaining to their electorates why leaving the European Union was absolutely essential and that they should vote for them in order to make it happen. So, I think being willing to argue this consistently, being able to ignore the dismissive attacks from political opponents, and being gracious, being willing to allow others to come in and claim credit for something that they didn't always necessarily agree with. That's how you build alliances. That's how you create a national movement. And it's wonderful to have been part of it. And it's wonderful to see, even now, people on the left of politics in this country recognizing that the referendum decision is final, that it's the right choice, and that we should leave. I was delighted the other day to listen to a hard left socialist in this country explaining why it was better that Britain left the European Union. We need to create that in a time of tribal politics. We need to create a consensus on this issue. We may not be a perfect country, but we should be a democracy, and that means we should make our own laws and not blame Europe and Brussels when we make our own mistakes.
You personally, in all this, though, you talk about building alliances. I mean, this is again just a complete sort of thumbnail sketch, but you must have lost a lot of relationships with people in the Conservative Party. You are as insistent about how UKIP was behaving and their profile and their image and their position in Parliament as you had been about the Conservatives.
I think what you're saying very diplomatically is that when I joined UKIP, I may have gifted them this great win. I may have helped boost their chances and their standing, but they weren't always totally appreciative of my advice and my input. I think that's probably fair, but look, I'm not a very party political person. I've always found it slightly odd that in politics people should support a particular team like you might support a soccer team or a baseball team or a basketball team. I look at political parties and I see strengths and weaknesses in all of them. And I'm generally on the right. I'm generally a small C conservative. I'm a passionate believer in the free market. I'm a libertarian. To a British audience, I would call myself a classical liberal, but I wouldn't want to use the term liberal to an American audience. They may misunderstand and think I'm something to do with Hillary Clinton.
Right.
I I I found in UKIP, like in the Conservatives, like in all political parties, good, but also a tribalism that I find rather worrying. Um, and sometimes in politics, some of the most vociferous advocates and followers of politics are only ever happy when those that they perceive as being their opponents, the enemy, the other, are disagreeing with them. And I don't get that at all. I when I was in politics saw it as a good thing if you could get the people that you're supposed to be disagreeing with, if you can disarm them and get them to agree with you. If you can find common ground, I don't mean middle ground, if you can find ways of appealing to them emotionally and get them on your side. And in order to do that, I felt there were certain issues that UKIP needed to frankly stop talking about, to put to one side. Look, politics in America right now and in Britain right now is incredibly tribal. I think actually the successful politicians of the near future will be those who find ways not of heightening the division by banging particular issues, but actually on occasion find ways of changing the exchange. So when I was in UKIP, for example, I'm not anti-immigration. I think immigration in this country has done a lot of good things. I think too much immigration can be very harmful, but I think we need to have an honest conversation about issues of cultural compatibility. But I think generally speaking, if you look at the United States experience of immigration, it's been generally pretty positive. It's a nation built on migration. So I used to argue that in order for UKIP to widen its support base, it needed to stop obsessing about the issue of immigration. If it wanted to win the argument on Europe, it needed the support of people who might not share its particular views on immigration. Now, that wasn't always a popular thing to advocate for, but I think the evidence from the referendum, where we did build this broader alliance and we did make a positive, optimistic, internationalist, globalist case for Britain leaving the European Union, I think that absolutely vindicates the argument. We should constantly, if we're in politics, be looking to build alliances. If you try and create a pure sect, you might feel good about yourself. You might say, look, I've got the support of this group and that group. But you need to build a broad-based movement. And I think that requires sometimes perhaps for the different tribes to slightly rethink their views on things.
For me, the starting pistol was fired when Nigel Farage was able to post his EU Parliament speeches on YouTube. And for the very first time, we actually had people of a different opinion actually being well lit and well presented. You know, regular media couldn't sort of subvert what was being said.
Absolutely. I mean, you and I are having a discussion now, which the BBC would never permit. No BBC studio in the UK would ever allow the kinds of views that you and I are articulating, which I think are actually pretty mainstream.
Pretty mainstream, yeah.
They would never allow them to be articulated. Everything has got to be seen through the prism of social justice and a hierarchy of guilt and oppression. It's very difficult in Britain today to find a diversity of opinion within the broadcast media. You can find diversity in terms of the heritage and the ethnicity and the gender of the presenters, but they are all marinated in a similar sort of groupthink. And you're absolutely right. I wrote a book called The End of Politics and the Birth of Our Democracy. It was an anthem to Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History and the Last Man. And I argued that the internet was going to fundamentally change politics. And I talked about how it would democratize the formation of opinion. Up until very recently, the news was defined by the broadcast media. Increasingly now, we all have our own Twitter feed, our own ticker tape of information. Opinions can be formed organically. People can look at a particular event, such as the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in America, and say, do you know what? The broadcast media's interpretation of this event doesn't tell you the whole story. It's not just a protest about social injustice and militarized policing. It's also a story about thugs looting and stealing, which has nothing to do with social justice. So, you see the democratization of opinion forming. And once you allow people to form their own opinions without having opinions spoon-fed to them by the same old leftist elite, then I think the whole center of gravity of politics starts to shift. Now, the left call this populism. I think they sound a little bit like perhaps some of those princes and priests in early modern Europe might have sounded when they complained that ordinary people in Europe were starting to interpret the scriptures for themselves during the Reformation. What we're seeing, I think, is the equivalent of a reformation in politics, the democratization of opinion, the overthrowing of a priesthood of pundits and media broadcasters, and we're starting to see some diverse and insurgent opinions. Now, sometimes some of these insurgent opinions are not particularly nice, not particularly, sometimes they're wrong. But I think we're starting to see a plurality of opinion. And of course, the old school media don't like it. But frankly, who cares what they think? They're increasingly excluded from the conversation. It's shows like yours that are increasingly shaping opinion in the US and America. And I think if you're a young person who lives in the age of Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager, it's possible to not engage with the old establishment media at all. And I actually think this is rather wonderful. I think it's the beginning of a wonderful change, a positive change for the future.
Look, it's a bit like the music business for me. It's like you had to, right up until 20 years ago, you had to have a record company, which was basically a bank that lent you money at horrible rates for you to then go and rent their studios from them to make something, because that technology was so expensive that the only access that you could have to it.
And distribution. There was probably some guy who knew some guy who knew the guy who would decide whether your record got airtime.
Exactly.
And a remote DJ on one of the radio stations basically decided what songs became hits and what became misses. That's gone now.
Absolutely.
You've got wonderful democratization of the consumption of music. It's fantastic.
I remember whatever it was, late 90s, it was like, this is the very first #1 record that has been recorded in somebody's bedroom, And now it's difficult to find one that hasn't been recorded in somebody's bedroom, because obviously the technology, now they're carrying it around with them. And it's happened to politics.
And everywhere this change happens, you see some of the underlying cultural assumptions in that industry shifting.
Exactly. It's the medium is the message,
Current affairs. But what I find really interesting, and I'd be fascinated if any of your viewers have got a good explanation for this, the publishing industry, I mean, particularly fiction and novels. I would have thought there would be a vast market in novels that people actually want to read. Yet so much of the publishing industry on both sides of the Atlantic is dominated by a cartel of publishers who only commission rather tedious novels and really boring writers who happen to tick all the various identity boxes. And there've been many a time when I thought, why can't I get a good novel? Why does every novel that's available for sale in a bookshop seem to have the same old tedious storylines in it? And I wonder if we've yet seen the full extent of this culture shift. I suspect there are industries like the book publishing industry where, yes, the technology is there. Yes, there could be this shift, but you still have the same old cartel churning out the same old cliched stuff. And I'd be fascinated to know why that is, whether it's just a question of time or maybe there's something about book publishing that's preventing this change from taking place. I don't know.
That's interesting. I don't know. I might be looking in the wrong place, but I'm sort of seeing the cartels dissolving, frankly. It's what I think we might see when you look back at Dickens, for instance, and writers of that time. They would... things like Christmas Carol was episodic. I mean, it was published weekly, I think. And depending on what reaction he got to previous chapter or passage.
Like Netflix. It was the
This
Netflix of its time.
exactly, I've got a feeling that the way, because what it all comes down to is like, okay, now we've got all this product, but how do you monetize it? And you might monetize the cliffhanger element now as opposed to the finished book.
I was having a conversation the other day with a friend of mine, and we both have access to Netflix and we both have access to the BBC's iPlayer. And we were talking about some of the entertainment and dramatic output. And pretty much everything you ever see produced by the BBC on iPlayer is, all the heroes tick all the identity boxes, the politically correct casting, the politically correct storylines. There's, everything is a sort of almost a sort of parody of a politically correct storyline. Doctor Who has become virtually unwatchable because it's a politically correct lecture from beginning to end. And yet when you go on to Netflix, you're seeing a whole variety of different programming that doesn't do any of that. And I wonder if you're seeing that the culture shift in media platforms like Netflix, where there's this hyper accountability to the subscriber, but the BBC, which is still funded through this taxation system, this compulsory TV tax we have in the UK, you still haven't seen the culture shift that's coming. I suspect that
it's the lack of market forces. The market forces are the great liberator of the poor and the disenfranchised. And
maybe Netflix could start doing news. Think about that. If Netflix started to do news, that would be something worth watching.
Oh no, completely. As I say, I think I believe in the wisdom of the crowd. I really do. I think I'm an idiot. I know I'm an idiot, but you get 1,000 of me in a room, and I'm a genius. It's the crowd that found the Beatles. 6 record companies turned the Beatles down. The crowd were wise enough to patch into them, and so that's. You see something like the anomaly. I can't. My wife's American. I try and explain the BBC license fee to her, and every sort of 6 months or so, she'll just walk in and go, "Okay, so you just buy like a laptop and it's got software. Yeah, you got to give them $200." It's just they cannot get their head around the idea that a state, basically a propaganda machine, but a state broadcaster can force you to buy its product, and then you see people going, "Well, what about what the Daily Mail says, whatever." It's like, yeah, but you don't have to buy the Daily Mail. You don't have to buy any other newspaper just because you buy the Morning Star or whatever. You're not compelled to pay for its competitors.
But even my kid's a big fan of Fuller House, one of America's great family TV shows of all time. The latest season's out. The BBC could not produce a program like Fuller House, because if the BBC got their hands on it, it would become a boring, sanctimonious lecture on identity and political correctness. Now, I haven't seen the latest episode of Fuller House. Maybe a bit of that's crept in. But instead of just entertaining people and entertaining kids and giving them a fun, engaging storyline, so much of the BBC's output is basically cultural Marxism. It's basically trying to patronize its audience by giving them lectures about the nature of human society and their role within it. And it's sinister, boring, and a turnoff.
It's even worse than that. That for me anyway, they get £3.5 billion a year, the BBC. And I was at the heart of this in the 2000s. I was making sort of comedy shows, but I had a production company, so I directly was getting the King shilling to make shows as an independent producer. And it's way. I've got this whole. I've talked to a few MPs about this on culture and media committees and stuff, trying to get their head around it. There's like a whole political class that's funded by that BBC. Because I'm not so bothered about the output. The output, yes, absolutely, is a lot of it's just woke or propagandized or steered. But the machinery that gets it made is basically propping up the London housing boom. It's like you've got comedians with production companies who are now worth like £70 million, and it's like, well, they haven't earned 70 million quid. What's happened? I don't know if you know. I'm really boring on this. This is a total aside.
Okay. This is new to me. Carry on.
This is the thing. This is my huge bugbear, and I to my credit, I did keep complaining about this when I was getting truckloads of money from the BBC. I did keep complaining to them, all right, whilst I was taking the cash.
That's why you're in California now, not in London.
Quite, exactly. So this is the point. What happens is, in America, if you want to make a TV show, if we've got an idea for a TV show, you and I, and it would be Dudridge Carswell. I'm sorry, I don't care whether it's alphabetic. It would be Dudridge Carswell. Okay. We take it to like NBC, and NBC says, "Okay, we like your show. You can make it here. We'll give you a cottage on the studio lot or whatever. And here's 10% of the actual budget is your fee. So it's a 5 million show. You're going to get 500,000. Okay, but make the show. And we use all their equipment and up to the value of $5 million, say, to make a show for NBC." What they do at the BBC, and this is unique to the BBC, Channel 4 don't do it, ITV make you go and get a loan. You actually get a purchase order from ITV and you take it to your bank and they actually give you an overdraft to make a show for ITV. The BBC just say, okay, and I had this, I did about 3 seasons for the BBC, and I go, okay, I think I can make this for like 60,000 an episode. And they go, well, actually, the budget for that slot is £200,000. And this is like 15 years ago. And it's 200,000 quid. And I'm like, yeah, but I can make it for 60,000. Yeah, the budget for 9 o'clock is 200,000. So it's fantastic. So you have to have the 200,000. I was like, okay, well, great. Our production fee is about 20,000. No, we give you 6 times 200,000 by check or wire transfer immediately. So suddenly you have this idea, and if you own the production company, you've got 1.2 million coming in straight away. Now, if you have 10 shows with them, you've got one staff in the office, but you've suddenly got like 10, 12 million quid coming through. And it's this perversion. Well, what it was Margaret Thatcher insisted on 25% of shows being independently produced. That's been perverted into every lock, stock and barrel bit of cash goes out of the BBC and just goes unaccounted straight to the production company. And you've created, in my opinion, a political class. This is almost like pre-Soviet, pre-Russia revolution. You've got this class of basically the bourgeoisie being funded by the populace of the UK to be totally unaccountable, and they can think and make whatever they like. But apart from that, they are sitting on huge amounts of wealth because, like I said, the BBC gives them the entire, but it's called housing, by the way. It's called housing. You house the project, okay? And I ended up in a stand-up fight with one of the biggest sort of comedy producers in the UK because I had a show proposal, and they went, yeah, brilliant. Okay, that's great. We'll give you 10% of the budget. I said, yeah, we're going to house it. And he went ballistic because the housing is where you get the 90% of the budget coming through, and you make it for peanuts. I know one guy who took £410,000 for, like, he used the company like a piggy bank for a BBC Three show. And his personal fee was 410,000. Anyway, that's the anomaly. I tell you, that is the one that's driving me absolutely up the wall. But I'm hoping that catches on somewhere. But anyway, yeah, I could bore about that forever. But yeah, that's the aspect of the BBC that also I find very sinister. We're funding our opponents.
Yeah, and this is why they don't want to get rid of the license fee. Every month in Britain, I have to pay, and it's probably the best £7.50 I spend every month. It gives me and my family hours of entertainment. I have to give the BBC £14, and they produce rubbish. And I don't watch the BBC, but if I don't pay that £14, they can send people around to my house and arrest me and put me in prison.
You can go to prison. You can actually go to prison. It's extraordinary.
If I don't pay my license fee, I will get a criminal record and be unable to come to the United States. That is the power that this evil cartel has over ordinary Britons.
There was the 7%. If I could just ask you, we just have a bit of dropout there on the Wi-Fi or the Skype or whatever. If you could just say what the £7 was, if you could just like say that again, because it's like every month I spend.
Every month I spend £7.50, I think it is, on my subscription to Netflix. And can I tell you, it's the best £7.50 I spend every month. It gives me and my family hours of entertainment, I have to spend roughly double that amount. I think it's £14 a month on the BBC license fee, double the amount that I pay to Netflix. And not only do I have to pay that, if I don't pay that, despite the fact I rarely watch the BBC, if I don't pay that annual subscription, I can be arrested and even sent to prison. In fact, if I didn't pay my license fee to the BBC, I could get a criminal record, which would prevent me from being able to go to the United States. That is the hold that this evil cartel has over ordinary Britons. You have to pay, or you get a criminal record. It's outrageous.
And just for the American listeners, okay, I've been saying this, and now you've heard it from somebody actually reputable. It's like it is that bad. Yes, you can go to prison for the equivalent of not paying NBC. It's a protection racket. But I wanted to just go on.
A while ago, I stopped my subscription to Spotify. I felt I was spending too much on different forms of entertainment, and I was trying a different platform for music. And so I just stopped paying my subscription to Spotify. And you know what they did? They sent me a very nice note saying, sorry to leave you as a customer. If you ever want to rejoin, this is how you do it. And that was the end of it. And a few months later, I rejoined. If I stopped paying my subscription to the BBC, I would get a threatening letter and law enforcement officers from a court turning up at my house with the threat of imprisonment and a criminal record. That is the difference between the BBC as an entertainment provider and the free market. When I was a member of Parliament, I used to have a lot of ordinary folk coming to see me if they had a problem with the authorities, and I would quite often have people come to see me threatened with prosecution for non-payment of the license fee. And what was so sad about it is the people who couldn't afford to pay were almost always women, and they were almost always poor, vulnerable single mothers who couldn't afford the license fee because they had to make other choices to feed their kids. And yet they were harassed and threatened with criminal proceedings in order to pay the salaries of these overpaid presenters. And it's one day I hope people will look at the injustice of the BBC and look at the people who run it like we today look at the Romanovs, this self-entitled elite. I only hope that we don't go the other way, and the reaction against the sort of people running the BBC doesn't mean we end up with what you might call sort of Bolshevik broadcasters.
I just love it. I love it. I know. I just the whole thread that runs through, without blowing too much smoke, the whole thread that runs through your from your biography, as I read it, anyway, is just this principle. It's always standing on actually exercising principle as opposed to just expressing it. It's really laudable.
Yeah. When I was in my teenage years, I was fortunate enough to go to a very good school, a very good boarding school in this country. And there were a lot of very rich and wealthy kids there. My parents weren't rich or wealthy at all. My father was a doctor in Central Africa. My mother was a doctor in Central Africa. They worked in a hospital that had power cuts, chronic shortage of medicine. They lived a very simple life in Africa. And I came to this school in the UK where there were a lot of kids from very wealthy backgrounds, and they quite often, I think, used to get given a lot of cash from their parents. I went and worked in Pizza Hut, and I waited at tables in the holidays in order to earn money. And you know what? I felt so good whenever I got given that paycheck at the end of the week, because I had worked for that and that was my money. And ever since then, I've always felt there's something slightly grubby about ever being given money that you haven't actually worked for. There's nothing more rewarding than having money to spend that you've worked for. And so just the idea that you should enjoy a pile of cash that doesn't belong to you and that comes from the taxpayer, it's not only wrong. We shouldn't. The people that are after that are the very last people that we should have in charge of our political system. Now, if you look at some of the great US presidents, people like Calvin Coolidge, a man long overrated, If you look back at Ronald Reagan, if you look back at a lot of America's great leaders, whatever strengths and weaknesses they had, they all tended to have this basic attitude, which is that taxpayer money is best left with the taxpayer where possible, and if you can give it back to them, give it back to them. We need change in our politics, but I hope we have political leaders that fundamentally believe that if it's not your money, give it back to the taxpayer.
I think that's. I think everybody would agree on that, or certainly most of my listeners. What's the next step for you then? What's the future? Are you in public life still, or are you pursuing any kind of political ambition ever again?
Well, in terms of elected politics, I feel I've done my bit. I stood for Parliament 4 times. I stood or felt that I was very heavily engaged in the referendum. And after 12 years, I just, I did what I set out to achieve, and I felt I'd done my bit. But I think there are things that we need to do as a country to change the system of public administration. When I was in politics, I was quite struck by how MPs who had served as ministers under Tony Blair and under David Cameron, and from both sides of the political divide, had found that the machinery of government had never actually been effective and efficient. It had never actually responded to the priorities of the elected MPs. And so I'm involved in a project at the moment which is trying to get ideas from both sides. It's called the Good Governance Project, and it's about trying to make sure that we reform the system of public administration so that when you elect someone who says they're going to do something, the machinery of the state actually responds to those priorities and gets on and does it. I suspect an awful lot of the anti-politician sentiment comes from this feeling that it doesn't matter who you vote for, you end up with the same political elite pursuing its own priorities rather than yours. I'd like to try and help reform the administrative state, to make sure it's much more accountable, and to make sure those who actually run public administration and make public policy, and whether they're civil servants and what have you, to make sure that they actually serve the public rather than make public policy priorities without reference to the public. So this is something I'm very involved in, and I'm trying to do it in a way that creates a bit of consensus. As I said, I think there are people, the equivalent of US Democrats and the equivalent of US Republicans here in the UK, who I think now, on both sides, now recognise we need to change the system of government in this country.
And it seems, so when you state it that way, it seems so obvious that that's how it should be, and it's alarming that it isn't. The accountability even needs to be addressed I still find quite terrifying. It's just like that's kind of a given.
Yeah, I mean the administrative state in the UK, like in DC, has grown and grown and grown. Every time there's ever been a recession in America or Britain, ordinary companies and ordinary privately run businesses have had to cut costs and look for efficiencies. Government's never had to do that. Yeah. And so there's a huge amount of waste and inefficiency built into the system. And I think it needs a radical overhaul. I really do. And I hope that this economic downturn caused by lockdown focuses a few minds. How can we make sure that for every tax dollar that we take from the public, we make sure that we give the public back a tax dollar worth of services? That's just not happening at the moment.
Listen, I think that's an uplifting note to end this on and let you go back and have your real life again. And I can't thank you enough for being on today.
Thank you for your time, Paul. And I look forward to seeing more of your shows in due course. Thank you.
Bless you. Thank you so much.